The city sky was gray, foreshadowing yet another gloomy day in the Jefferson neighborhood, a place where the streets were always filled with wary eyes, hurried footsteps, and the constant blaring of car horns. Ethan Carter, a young police officer who had joined the force a few years ago, sat in his patrol car, his eyes scanning the rearview mirror. He felt accustomed to the rhythm of life in this area, but his mind was still riddled with prejudice. Jefferson, a criminal hub where those black guys never do anything but cause trouble. Ethan muttered to his partner, an older officer behind the wheel. The older officer smirked faintly. "You'll get used to it. Around here, if something seems suspicious, check it out. Don't hesitate." Ethan straightened in his seat as he noticed a black man walking along the sidewalk, carrying an old canvas bag. The man appeared calm, his gaze steady, but to Ethan, that demeanor alone was suspicious enough. "Stop the car," Ethan said coldly. The patrol car pulled up to the curb, and Ethan stepped out. His flashlight switched on in broad daylight as a show of authority. He approached the man, blocking his path. "What are you doing here?" Ethan asked, his voice heavy with authority. The man raised his head, his deep-set eyes seemingly holding stories Ethan couldn't comprehend. "I'm walking. Is there a problem, officer?" His tone was calm, but his gaze carried a trace of weariness. Perhaps he had endured too many encounters like this. "Do you have ID? Prove where you live," Ethan pressed, ignoring any pretense of politeness. "I don't need to prove anything. I've lived in this neighborhood for over 20 years. The man replied. Ethan's patience began to fray. Without asking for permission, he grabbed the man's bag and rummaged through it. Inside were a few old books, a water bottle, and a handkerchief. Nothing suspicious, but Ethan decided to escalate the situation anyway. "What are you hiding? Why avoid the police?" Ethan demanded sharply. "I'm not hiding. I'm just living my life," the man replied, his voice steady but firm. The tension quickly escalated as Ethan shoved the man against the wall and cuffed his hands behind his back. A few passers-by stopped, pulling out their phones to record. The man didn't resist, but his eyes grew icy. A fleeting sense of unease crept into Ethan's mind, but he quickly dismissed it. Just a few hours later, the video of the encounter between Ethan and the black man flooded social media. On news platforms, the footage was headlined as "Police Racism Strikes Again." The comments beneath the posts brimmed with outrage. "This is what we have to endure every single day. That man did nothing wrong. Why was he treated like that? This officer needs to be fired immediately." At the police station, Ethan entered the conference room where his colleagues were watching the video on a large screen. The atmosphere in the room was tense. Ethan's boss, Police Chief David Carter, sat at the head of the table, his expression stern. "Carter, do you realize what you've done?" David said, his voice commanding. Sweat formed on Ethan's forehead. "I was just doing my duty, Chief. That man looked suspicious, and I had the right to investigate. You had no right to humiliate or use unjustified force. Do you understand the impact of this video going viral online?" David responded, his eyes filled with disappointment. Ethan remained silent. He had no idea how to justify himself. That evening, David Carter sat in his office, his eyes fixed on the computer screen, where the video replayed over and over. He couldn't stop thinking about the man in the footage. There was something familiar about that face, something he couldn't immediately place. He decided to look up the man's records. His name was Elijah Moore, a resident of the Jefferson neighborhood. When David opened the file, it hit him like a bolt of lightning. Elijah Moore was his biological father. Memories of years long past flooded back. David recalled his childhood as a biracial boy raised in his white mother's household. Elijah, proud black man, had once loved David's mother, but due to family pressure, he had been forced to leave her. From that point on, David had never seen his father again. And now, that same man was enduring injustice at the hands of David's own team, a realization that twisted his heart in anguish. David decided to meet Elijah in person to apologize and clear the air. When he arrived at Elijah's house, the older man opened the door, his eyes cold and guarded. "What are you doing here?" Elijah asked, his voice laced with anger. "I need to talk to you. I want to apologize for what happened yesterday. That officer is under my supervision, and I'll make sure this is dealt with," David said, his voice trembling. Elijah stared at David for a long moment before letting out a bitter laugh. "You think an apology is enough? Do you have any idea what I endure every single day?" David nodded, his heart heavy. "I'm not just apologizing as the police chief. I'm apologizing as your son." Elijah froze. The words hit him like a blade cutting through the past. He stepped back, his eyes scanning David from head to toe, as if trying to confirm he hadn't misheard. "Son, after all these years, you show up and say that?" Elijah's voice was thick with bitterness. David didn't know how to respond. "I know I was wrong not to find you sooner, but I want to make it right. Please, give me a chance." Elijah didn't respond immediately. He closed the door, leaving David standing alone in the dark night. The next day, Jefferson was anything but quiet. The video of Ethan Carter assaulting Elijah had become the focal point of social media and local news outlets. Protesters gathered in front of the police station, holding signs and chanting slogans. "Justice for Elijah Moore. End racism in the police force. No more violence against Black lives." At the center of the protest was a young woman named Angela, a social activist, holding a megaphone and leading the crowd. "We cannot let this injustice continue. Elijah Moore is not the first, but we will make sure he is the last." Ethan Carter sat in the police station, his eyes fixed on the computer screen displaying live footage of the protests. The signs, the chants, and the weight of public outrage bore down on him. Colleagues passing by cast him glances filled with both reproach and concern. "You've really stirred up a mess this time, Ethan," one colleague remarked. "The chief isn't happy." In the conference room, Police Chief David Carter stood before the Internal Review Board, striving to maintain his composure as he addressed the situation. "We need to act immediately. An internal investigation is underway, and Officer Ethan Carter has been placed on suspension to ensure the fairness of the process." One of the board members spoke up. "David, you understand this could damage the reputation of the entire police department, don't you?" David nodded, his expression resolute. "I'm aware, and I'm prepared to take responsibility. But if we don't confront this issue head-on, we will lose the trust of the community forever." That evening, David decided to return to Elijah's house. This time, he brought a handwritten apology letter, expressing his remorse and desire to make amends. When he knocked on the door, Elijah opened it with an indifferent look but didn't send David away immediately. "I don't want to hear any more apologies," Elijah said bluntly, his voice cold. "Please, give me a chance. I'm not here just as the police chief. I'm here as your son," David said, his voice pleading. Elijah sat down on an old chair in the living room, his eyes fixed on David. "Do you think that just because you call me your father, everything will change? I've spent my whole life being treated like I'm less than human because of the color of my skin. And now, one of your men has done the same." David lowered his head and quietly placed the letter on the table. "I can't undo what's happened, but I can try to make it right. I want to do something to help you and this community." Elijah didn't reply. He simply looked at David with a deep, probing gaze, as if trying to judge whether his words were genuine. The next morning, David received a call from a local journalist. The story about Elijah and his connection to David had leaked. An article titled "The Police Chief and the Assaulted Man," a family story, quickly spread everywhere. David found himself thrust into the center of public scrutiny. At the police station, his colleagues were buzzing with gossip. "He's Moore's son? Can you believe it? This is insane. This could ruin our reputation." Meanwhile, Elijah received a wave of attention from the community. Neighbors stopped by to express their support and sympathy. But for Elijah, the spotlight only added to his exhaustion. That evening, Elijah sat alone in his living room, staring at an old photograph of a young David. In the picture, David was a smiling boy sitting on Elijah's lap. Elijah recalled the days when he had once hoped his son would grow up in a fairer world. But now, he couldn't help but wonder if the world had truly changed at all. Meanwhile, Ethan Carter, suspended from duty, was stuck at home. His small apartment felt more stifling than ever. He avoided his phone and social media, but the images of Elijah Moore continued to haunt him. One evening, Ethan decided to leave the house and went to a small cafe on the outskirts of town. There, he ran into an old friend, Marcus, a black man who had attended police academy with him. Marcus recognized Ethan immediately, his disappointment evident. "Ethan, I never thought you'd turn out like this," Marcus said bluntly. "Like what?" Ethan asked defensively. Marcus looked him straight in the eye. "You know what I mean. That video, I thought you'd be different, that you wouldn't let prejudice cloud your judgment." Ethan remained silent. It was the first time he was forced to confront his actions through someone else's perspective. I was just following protocol," he stammered. "Protocol?" Marcus asked, his voice calm but heavy with meaning. "Ethan, did you ever stop to ask yourself why you suspected him in the first place? What did he do to deserve being treated like that?" Ethan felt as though a weight was pressing down on his chest. He had no answer. Marcus's question made him confront the biases he had carried with him, biases shaped by his upbringing, his family, and society. On the streets of Jefferson, protests continued to swell. People from all over gathered in the area to voice their outrage. No longer just a chorus of angry shouts. The movement had become organized and systematic. Angela, passionate social activist, stood on a makeshift wooden platform in the central square, addressing the hundreds gathered before her. "We are not just fighting for Elijah Moore. We are fighting for everyone who has been denied their rights simply because of the color of their skin. Today, we are here to send a message. Justice cannot be ignored." Cheers and applause erupted. Among the crowd were people of all races, black, white, and other ethnic groups standing shoulder to shoulder, holding banners that read, "Justice for all. End racial violence. No one left behind." From a distance, David Carter stood in his police uniform, watching the crowd. The weight of the situation pressed heavily on him. But instead of ordering the protesters to disperse, as many other police chiefs might have done, he chose to listen. In his eyes were not just concern but also regret and a determination to make things right. Angela stepped down from the platform and approached David. "What are you doing here, Chief? Keeping tabs on us?" she asked, her tone challenging. David responded calmly, "No, I'm here to listen, and if you'll allow me, I'd like to say a few words to the crowd." Angela studied him for a moment, gauging the sincerity in his words. Finally, she nodded. David climbed onto the platform, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. He could feel the mix of suspicion, anger, and hope directed at him. Taking a deep breath, he began to speak. "My name is David Carter, and I am the chief of police in this city. I stand here today not to justify, but to apologize. Elijah Moore is not just a resident of this neighborhood. He is my father. What happened to him was unacceptable, and it happened under my leadership. I am deeply sorry for allowing prejudice to persist within the force I oversee." The crowd fell silent for a moment, then began murmuring. Some were shocked, others skeptical, but David's words left an impression. Angela stepped forward, taking the microphone. "Your words are noted, Chief, but we need to see action. What will you do to ensure this doesn't happen again?" David nodded, his expression resolute. "We will reform. I promise that our officers will receive cultural sensitivity training, and any misconduct will be dealt with swiftly and strictly. I can't change the past, but I will do everything in my power to change the future. Meanwhile, Ethan Carter remained suspended from duty, but the events at the square had struck a chord with him. He could no longer ignore the criticism, the disappointed looks, and the questions Marcus had asked him. Ethan decided to attend a community workshop on social justice, fully aware that his presence might not be welcomed. The workshop was held in a small community center. Participants sat in a circle, sharing their stories. An elderly woman spoke up. "I've lived in this neighborhood for over 50 years, and I've lost count of how many times I or my family have been harassed by the police for no reason. We're not criminals. We just want to live in peace." Ethan kept his head down, listening, each word hitting his pride like a punch. A young man named Jamal fixed his gaze on Ethan. "You think wearing a uniform gives you the right to act like that? You're trained to protect us, but instead, you make us afraid." When it was his turn, Ethan stood up, avoiding everyone's eyes. "My name is Ethan Carter. I'm a police officer, and I made a mistake. I have no excuse. I just want to say that I was wrong, and I want to change." A few skeptical glances were cast his way, but Ethan knew this was only the beginning. After the workshop, Marcus approached him. "You did the right thing, Ethan, but words aren't enough. Let your actions prove it." Elijah Moore sat on the wooden chair in his living room, his calloused hands cradling a cup of hot tea. The past few days had felt like a storm, filled with anger, exhaustion, and a faint, uncertain hope for change. When David knocked on the door again, Elijah didn't turn him away. He invited David inside but maintained a cautious distance. "Are you here to apologize again?" Elijah asked. David shook his head. "I'm here to listen. I want to understand more about what you've been through." Elijah was silent for a long moment before he began to speak. He talked about the times he had faced discrimination in his youth, the jobs he had been denied because of his skin color, and the deep pain of being forced to leave his son behind. "I used to hope you'd grow up in a better world, but here we are, still facing the same old injustices." David felt a painful squeeze in his chest. "I can't change what happened to you, but I want to do something to make it right." Elijah took a sip of his tea, his gaze softening. "I used to think forgiveness was a sign of weakness, but now I see that forgiveness is strength. I'm not ready to forgive Ethan easily, but I'm willing to give him a chance to make amends." A week later, David organized a community meeting at the city center. Ethan was present, fully aware that his presence would spark controversy. Before hundreds of attendees, David announced plans to reform the police department, including cultural sensitivity training, the establishment of an independent oversight committee, and a firm commitment to addressing misconduct. Ethan stepped onto the stage, his eyes meeting the community's. "My name is Ethan Carter. I know that what I did cannot be forgiven immediately, but I promise to work toward change, not just for myself but for the system I'm part of. I hope you'll give me a chance." In the crowd, Elijah stood up. He walked to the front, his eyes locking with Ethan's. "Your actions hurt me deeply, but if you're truly committed to change, I'll give you a chance." Applause broke out, not because everyone had forgiven, but because they saw a glimmer of hope. Change wouldn't happen overnight, but that day, Jefferson witnessed the beginning of something new. After standing before the community to admit his mistakes, Ethan Carter felt as though a heavy weight had been lifted from his shoulders. But he knew this was only the beginning. Back at home, he began to reflect more deeply. Memories of his childhood resurfaced, stories his parents had told him, subtle lessons laden with prejudices about race that he had absorbed unconsciously. One morning, Ethan walked into Elijah Moore's law office unannounced. As he entered, he saw Elijah sitting behind his desk, his eyes stern but no longer as cold as before. "Mr. Moore," Ethan began, his voice trembling, "I'm not just here to apologize for what I've done. I want to understand, and if possible, I want to help." Elijah leaned back in his chair, his fingers interlocked. "How do you think you can help, Ethan? Do you believe a simple apology and a few gestures of goodwill can erase the pain I've endured for a lifetime? Ethan nodded, his gaze steady. I don't believe that, but I know that if I don't start somewhere, I'll always be part of the problem. I'm willing to listen, and I'm willing to learn. Elijah lifted his glasses and studied Ethan carefully. Good. If you're truly serious, join the weekly community workshops we host. You'll hear the stories of people who have been hurt by you and the system you represent. And you'll understand. Ethan nodded without hesitation. I'll be there. As Ethan began his journey of redemption, Police Chief David Carter embarked on implementing major changes within the police department. He held a meeting with the entire team to present his reform plans. We've allowed biases and misconduct to persist for far too long, David said, his voice resonating through the meeting room. We can no longer turn a blind eye. Starting today, every officer will participate in cultural awareness training and learn how to work with the community fairly and respectfully. The reactions in the room were mixed. Some officers, like Sarah, a white woman who had been with the department for over 15 years, nodded in agreement. Others, like Ryan, a younger officer, couldn't hide their discontent. Chief, Ryan spoke up. Are we doing this just because of public pressure? Why should we change when we're the ones protecting the community? David turned to Ryan, his gaze firm. We don't just protect the community, Ryan. We serve the community. If you can't understand that, then maybe this isn't the right place for you. The meeting ended on a tense note, but David knew he couldn't please everyone. The first steps of reform always faced resistance, but he was ready to confront the challenges head-on. One late afternoon, David received a call from Elijah. Do you have a moment? I'd like to see you. Elijah's voice came through on the other end. David drove to Elijah's small house. As he stepped inside, he noticed the room was tidier than before. On the table, 2 cups of coffee were already prepared. Have a seat, Elijah said, his voice calm but no longer tense. David sat down, his eyes cautiously studying Elijah. Why did you call me here? Elijah sighed. I've been thinking a lot. About you. About us. I used to think I didn't need you anymore. But the truth is, I was wrong. I don't want to live in the past any longer. If you're willing, I'd like to try and rebuild this relationship. David felt a lump in his throat. He couldn't believe the father he'd been estranged from for over 30 years could say these words. Thank you, David said, his voice choked with emotion. I want that too. The two sat together, saying little, but their shared presence was enough to begin bridging the gap that had divided them for so many years. The next day, David, Elijah, and Ethan participated in a press conference at the city's central square. The event, organized by the community, was attended by activists, residents, and police officers alike. On stage, Angela spoke first. Today, we're not just here to talk about the past. We're here to talk about the future, about how we can come together to build a better, stronger community. David stepped forward to speak next. As the police chief, I pledge that this department will no longer tolerate misconduct. But I also know that change cannot come from one side alone. We need the cooperation and trust of the community. Elijah was invited to the stage. He looked out at the crowd, his eyes bright but filled with emotion. I have lived through the darkest times of racial injustice. But today, I am not here to talk about anger or hatred. I am here to talk about forgiveness and opportunity. Finally, Ethan took the stage, his gaze meeting the crowd. I was wrong, and I know that saying sorry is not enough, but I promise to dedicate the rest of my life to doing what is right. I want to be part of the solution, not the problem. Applause followed, not because forgiveness was complete, but because hope had been rekindled. Jefferson was no longer a fractured community. It was becoming a place where change began with small yet meaningful steps. From that day forward, Ethan actively participated in community initiatives. David pushed for stronger reforms within the system, and Elijah became a symbol of resilience and forgiveness in the city. Together, They not only transformed their own lives but also became an example for many others to follow. As dawn broke over the Jefferson neighborhood, Elijah Moore's story was no longer just a social media outrage. It had become a symbol of injustice, reconciliation, and hope. Elijah, who had lived in the shadows of pain for decades, now stood tall and stronger than ever. One day, Elijah received a call from a major publishing house. "Mr. Moore," the editor said over the phone, "we'd like to publish a book about your story. It will inspire so many people." Elijah sat silently for a moment. He wasn't one for the spotlight, but he understood that his story could spark change. After careful thought, he agreed. Over the next few months, Elijah worked with a team of editors to document his journey. From his youth marred by discrimination, being forced to leave his son, to the incident with Ethan, and his path to forgiveness. The book, titled Light in the Darkness, was released and quickly became a phenomenon. Television interviews, book signings, and public speaking engagements became part of Elijah's new life. At a large book signing event, a young black boy, around 12 years old, approached Elijah, his eyes wide with admiration. "Mr. Elijah, you're my hero." The boy said, "I want to grow up to be like you, brave and kind." Elijah smiled, crouched down, and placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. "Young man, always remember that the greatest courage is never giving up on doing what's right, even when it's the hardest thing to do." Ethan Carter, once the center of public outrage, had become a symbol of change. After completing cultural awareness courses and participating in community initiatives, Ethan began working with a nonprofit organization dedicated to supporting victims of police violence. He was no longer a uniformed officer, but the drive to protect and serve still burned within him. One day, Ethan visited a local high school to share his story, realizing it was an opportunity to inspire the next generation. In a packed classroom, he began recounting his journey. "I made mistakes. I used to think I understood everything. But the truth is, I understood nothing. What matters most is that I learned to listen. And I learned to change." A black student raised his hand and asked, "Were you scared to face your mistakes?" Ethan nodded, terrified, "But I realized that fear is not a reason to avoid change. If we don't confront the truth, we can't move forward." After the talk, many students approached Ethan to thank him. He felt his heart warm, knowing his efforts were not in vain. David Carter continued to lead the police department with a completely new approach. He organized regular meetings with the community to listen to their feedback and concerns. He also established an independent committee made up of members from various ethnic groups to oversee the department's operations. One of David's most significant initiatives was the creation of the Police for Justice program. This program invited officers to engage with the community, not as enforcers of the law but as allies and partners. At a program event, David invited Angela to the stage to speak about the community's role in reforming the system. Angela, who had once clashed fiercely with David, now stood beside him with a sense of trust. "We demanded justice, and today, we see that it's no longer just a dream. Real change is happening, and I believe we can continue to build a better community together," Angela said. After the event, a young officer approached David. "Chief," he said, "I want to thank you. These reforms have made me feel proud to wear this badge again." David smiled. "Thank you, but we still have a lot of work to do." One spring morning, Elijah, David, and Ethan attended the grand opening of a new community center in Jefferson. The center, built with contributions from the police, the community, and nonprofit organizations, was named the Elijah Moore Hope Center to honor Elijah's efforts in advancing social justice. At the ceremony, people gathered, children laughing and playing in the recreation area, and elders smiling as they witnessed a community more united than ever. Elijah stepped onto the podium, his eyes shining with emotion. "We've been through difficult times, but today, I see light in everyone's eyes. This isn't just my light. It's the light of all of us, those who have fought, learned, and changed together. Behind Elijah stood David and Ethan, watching him with deep respect. The three of them, once divided by prejudice and pain, now stood side by side, representing unity and hope. As the ceremony ended, Elijah stepped outside the center and gazed up at the clear blue sky. He smiled, feeling the peace he had longed for all his life. Jefferson was no longer a place of hurt and injustice. It had become a symbol of forgiveness, healing, and new beginnings. And so, the story concluded not just with a happy ending but with a message. Every journey of change begins with a single step, and the light of hope can always shine from the darkest places.